welcome. It's great to have lots of external people here today. We don't always have external people. So my name is Holly Joseph, and I am the director of the Centre for Literacy and Multilingualism at the University of Reading. And I'm delighted to see you all here today and welcome you to today's talk. Some of you may have attended CeLM events previously, and you may already know what we do, but for those of you who don't, I'll just say a few words. So our mission is to work within the field of literacy and multilingualism to conduct research, engage with practitioners and the general public, and train the next generation of researchers. And we have 5 research themes within our sort of broad literacy and multilingualism, which are language and literacy, migration, health, cognition and neuroscience, and education. And tonight's talk, or today's talk, is hosted by our 2 health theme leads, Emma Pagnamenta and Vishnu Nair, who isn't here, but he was very much involved in inviting Betty and suggesting this as a topic. So if you could keep your microphones muted while Betty's speaking, but then I think we'd be very happy for you to come on camera and on mic and make contributions. But just while one person is speaking, it's very helpful to have your microphone muted. Feel free to post any comments or questions in the chat at any time, and Emma and I will kind of keep track of those. I don't know if you can see the chat, Betty, can you? Yeah, I need to click on something to see it. If you click on chat, yeah. So, I mean, you don't need to, but if you want to, you might want to have a look at the chat. I find it very distracting personally, but, you know, sometimes it's good to look. And just to note that tonight's event is being recorded and will be uploaded with Betty's permission to our YouTube channel, and I'll post that on social media for those who want to watch. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Emma Pagnamenta, who will introduce Betty.
Thanks, Holly. So I'm absolutely delighted to introduce Professor Betty Yu this evening. Betty is a professor in the Department of Speech, Language and Hearing Sciences at San Francisco State University and a managing co-editor of the Journal of Critical Study of Communication Disability. Her work focuses on communication access among racially minoritized disabled children in multilingual communities. Betty is also an advisory board member to the Asian Pacific Islander Speech Language Hearing Caucus and the founding member of Speech Language and Hearing Sciences Equity Action Collective in the United States. Tonight, Betty is going to be talking to us about deconstructing by multilingualism, social communication, and autistic sociality with a focus on clinical application. Thank you, Betty. I'm going to hand over to you now.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I am all about context, as you'll see when we start talking, and I will just let you know I feel so kind of harried right now because we have 2 cats and we have a flea infestation at home. We moved to this hotel room last night, last minute, because my kid was getting bitten so much. And then I was driving her, I dropped her off at preschool and I had to go home and pack lunch and I barely made it here on time. So if I'm kind of like breathing hard or sweating, which I am, I'm sweating, that's what's happening. Also, I was gonna clean up behind me, but you know what, it's just life, all right? So you are entering a moment in my life. I have been thinking about, so I started practicing in speech language therapy, and I know in the UK the title is SLT, speech language therapy. In the US, it's a little bit more telling. I think the title is speech language pathology, and my license says I'm a speech language pathologist, which I think, really gets to the I think it's a very honest title for the way that the discipline has been set up. So historically, it has come from a medical tradition. It is still very much strongly rooted in a medical tradition. And I was thinking about the title of today's talk and the deconstruction, and wondering what it is that we're trying to deconstruct. And oh, by the way, I had been chatting with Holly and Emma about this earlier, that I would very much like for this to be conversational. I have a lot of materials, but I could sort of shrink and expand as it fits the time. We have an hour, I believe. Yeah, so feel free to raise your hand or to interject at any point. So some of the things that I think need deconstructing is the very idea of the object of our work. And the way that I was trained, and I'm not sure if that's the case for you as well. I know this is an international audience, and maybe we have a different, maybe we are coming from different traditions. It's very much about diagnosing, identifying problems and fixing those. And there's some really strong assumptions built into that the problems exist in the person. That diagnosis is necessarily a problem, really, that it is an indicator that something needs to be righted, that has gone wrong. And so this remediation-minded approach to our work is it's so ingrained in the DNA of the profession that it becomes invisible. So just the very fact of saying, for example, this next sentence I'm going to say will appear completely nonsensical to at least US practitioners, which is, my position is there's no such thing as a communication disorder. They're only people trying to communicate. But the field is called communication disorder. The funding, our funding agencies are institutes of communicative disorders. All of it is around that. So that's one thing that's worth deconstructing, is if we put at the center the people that we're supposedly, attending to what degree are they merely objects, and to what degree are they really at the center and the voices and the experiences driving the work? And I would say, there are some really strong indicators that they're purely objects of the work and not the center and the agents of some collective care work, because there are very few people with communication disabilities who are professionals in the field. They're starting to be, and it's kind of specific to the subspecialties within the field. So I know in the area of stuttering, for example, many of the leading scholars in that area are stutterers themselves. We're starting to see a little bit of a movement in the area of autism and neurodiversity. We're seeing a lot more people who are, and by the way, there have always been autistic people in the field. It just wasn't safe to identify yourself as such. And it is, sometimes safe and sometimes not now, but there are more people coming forward and identifying as autistic and also driving a different agenda with autism at the center. And that is, you may have heard that as the neurodiversity affirming movement. And you'll see that the proposed work sounds very, very different, right? So from the stuttering, from stuttering scholars, the stuttering is not seen as a problem. And, so the goal is not to get rid of stuttering. Very, very similarly, autism is not a problem. And so the idea is not to reform people to become less autistic, which for years and years, and I would argue even now, a lot of the therapies focus on really teaching people to appear more neurotypical, to have eye contact in certain ways, to, have turn taking occur in a particular pace that's seen to be appropriate. And so these are all things to explore. And in my particular, in my work, I've been looking at bilingualism among autistic children. and by the way, I'm choosing to use identity first language. So you'll hear me say autistic children, for example, as a child, as opposed to a child with autism. I'm choosing to use the word disability and disabled and also in a very intentional way as a to juxtapose disorder and pathology. And if you would like to, I don't know, learn more or discuss more about just the languaging around these things and what that signals in terms of our stance, that would be a very, very interesting conversation. So that's one thing that I've been trying to figure out is how do we facilitate and really support people and expressing themselves fully and also participating, to whatever degree they wish, without rendering them, disordered, without pathologizing them in the process. And in terms of, I'll just start more on the autism side, and soon enough we'll have to get a lot more intersectional because we're also talking about multilingualism, and that comes with issues of immigration and race and class and all the rest of it. But just in terms of autism, a lot of the work for Oh, by the way, I meant to do this earlier. I wonder how do people here identify their own professional positioning? Are there other SLTs in the group, or
I think so. Maybe people could put it in the chat. I think there are a lot of SLTs. Am I right?
Yeah, because I think that some of the things that I'm saying may or may not be relevant to those of you who are in linguistic anthropology, for example. I would probably just angle this a little bit differently, and maybe to explain more about why it is that I'm, from the position of SLT, we're wrestling with particular things. Oh yeah, so we are talking with SLTs here. Yeah, oh, congratulations, recently qualified. All right, okay. Then I'm going to assume some shared knowledge and struggles here. So yeah, I was a practicing SLT for probably 5 years before I went back to get my doctorate. And the impetus for that is that in the US, about back in those days, so I got my license in 1999. And back in those days, there were probably 4 or 5% of the members of the American Speech Language Hearing Association, the SLPs in the American Speech Language Hearing Association, who speak languages other than English at all. And so there are very few of us. And then most of that 4 or 5% were Spanish speaking. And I speak Mandarin Chinese. And so I was getting referrals from everywhere, up and down California. People, we didn't have video chats back then. And so if that had been available, I bet the referrals would have come from even wider distance. But so, yeah, I was just, hour after hour, day after day, really, working with families who had some shared concerns, particularly about their home language use. So their child has just been identified as, needing speech language therapy. And the very first question I would get, of course, is it because we're speaking more than one language? And I would say, no, there's no evidence for that. But also there was very little evidence one way or the other. So, that was one of the reasons, was that I had these questions kept coming up that I couldn't answer confidently. I had my feelings on it, for sure. And then other questions were, if we wanted to, because all of the services were in English, not just speech therapy, also occupational therapy, also their special education services, all the classroom services that they were, the parents were really depending on. If those were all in English, then the other question is, well, should we stop speaking Chinese to speed up the English, because then that's going to really help them maximize, right, and get what they need from all their services. And again, I couldn't really say confidently one way or the other based on evidence, but I had my feelings about that. It seems like there's a lot to be lost, to stop speaking our home languages. So that's why I went back for research degrees, because I wanted to start looking into some of these things myself. And so I ran into a few things. I had focused on autism and bilingualism, because that was the population that I was, working with quite a lot, and I had a lot of interest in. And so fast forward, I think at this point, I wanted to explore with you a couple of things that I had to wrestle with and really, find ways to get around or soften or question. I have a lot of questions about. One is most autistic children, as they're receiving speech language therapy, the primary issue is not around speaking, and often even not around language. It's really about social interaction and connectedness, and more narrowly speaking, in SLP land, we often call that pragmatics. Pragmatics, of course, has a more narrow meaning just around, language use and social interaction. And I would like for us to think more broadly about social communication as beyond language as well. But one of the things that I found very frustrating is that the view of pragmatics is very much structural. So that, for example, we would go through, I was trained to look at speech acts, for example, or to look at like presupposition, or to see if children were responding appropriately or inappropriately to particular moments. And so this anchoring to appropriateness, like if you open up any pragmatic test, I don't know if those of you have, those of you here have looked at a pragmatic test recently used by speech language therapists. They're very much anchored to normativity. And so like a typical question might, be the clinician reading a scenario to a child or an adult, and then asking, what should you do in this moment? Like, Johnny and Mary, see each other in the hallway, and Mary says hi, and Johnny doesn't answer. What should Mary do next? That kind of thing, and there's a correct answer and incorrect answers. And so, it is troubling in that way, because we know that, right, real life is much more complex than that there are times that people don't answer us, and it does not cause a massive communication breakdown, and there are good reasons for really any reaction. And so so the prescriptiveness, I think, of our methods, the way we assess, the way we do therapy, that became more and more troubling for me. And especially as I was getting to know the literature and also the people involved in disability justice work, was that the goals were so different from the clinical field of making correct than from the disability community themselves, which is participation, validation, and being visible. And so that's something that to reconcile. And And then when it comes to the bilingualism and multilingualism, again, it's the structural insistence on the structural in service of the prescriptive. So, seeing, for example, what is a structural approach to bilingualism, multilingualism, is seeing the languages as real, that there's a hard border that defines, it differentiates Mandarin, Chinese from English. Okay. And that, for example, if you do a language sample, you have to, count the utterances in one language separate from the utterances of another language to get your mean length of utterance and to, figure out your syntax and figure out when code switching is happening. And code switching also, thinking about it like, oh, I'm hard switching from one language to another one. And that in the moments where I'm using one or the other, it is only one or the other. Now, then I started encountering things like this as I was using. So I had the good fortune, I think, in the moment I was quite confused by it because it was so different from my disciplinary origins. My doctoral advisor was a linguistic anthropologist. And so she taught me ethnography and she taught me conversation analysis and discourse analysis. And I didn't know what to do with any of that, even though I enjoyed it very much, because the intent and the spirit and the processes were all antithetical to speech language therapy. It is about description, not prescription. It's about describing and understanding rather than diagnosing and and locating symptoms. It has no remediational aspirations, whereas as a speech language therapist, I'm meant to do nothing else. And so again, there were years of my life that I was kind of just learning a new way of thinking without quite knowing what to do with it. And I'm introducing a similar fracture to you. I think it's just I'm going to show you a different approach, and maybe all of us can figure out what we do with that. I've sort of come to my positions on that. So as I was observing and recording families, families were speaking 1, 2, 5 languages in their homes, interacting with their autistic children. One, I was seeing that, this rigid way of talking about social communicative competence was just not working. I mean, the children were bringing a lot of competencies that were not being recognized. And then, and that were often through non-spoken modalities, through the glance of an eye, through the pacing, through, proximity, through haptics, through touch, through the musicality, the lilt in their voice, through echolalia, through all these things that were considered symptoms of things that we're supposed to correct. But when you look at it, when you observe it, you just have to come to a different conclusion. You see the agency and the participation, the creativity, right, in all these things that are not being recognized. And in terms of the bilingualism and multilingualism, I would hear phrases like, eat rice la. So this is from a family who was committed to speaking only English. They're a multilingual family. They spoke Mandarin Chinese, Taiwanese Chinese, which is another dialect, as well as, I forget, there was another dialect that they spoke. And they were really, really worried about, not speaking any of those languages except for English, because the pediatrician told them, to do that, to speak only English. Their teacher did, their speech therapist did. So, I mean, they just really had the fear put in them. So knowing the parents and having spent time with the parents, and I knew that, they were so much more comfortable speaking their Chinese dialects in English. I asked for permission to see, what does it look like? How do you go about it? And so I would encounter and capture on recording things like "eat rice la." Okay, so that's something that, for example, Dad would yell upstairs to the children to tell them it's time for dinner. Eat rice. Do you know what eat rice is? Eat rice doesn't mean literally eating just the rice. It means taking a whole meal. It's time to eat rice. It's time to have dinner. In Hakka, which is one of the dialects of my mom's side of the family, you can greet somebody with eat rice. Have you eaten rice yet today? It means how are you? Right? So, I mean, you just see, what does it mean to speak English? Those are all English words, right? But it's saturated. Like, you see this, the sedimentation of all their other languages in there, in terms of the meaning, in terms of the syntax. Eat rice la. The prosody of it, that marker at the end, la, eat rice la. I mean, it's
tonight you want to which horse? Husband which Uber sleep? You want to which horse sleep? You want to which grandma? You want to which daddy? Which daddy?
Okay. So without seeing them, it might be hard to figure out what they're saying, because Grandpa of this child Oscar, he's trying to adhere to their English only rule in the house that they've established. And so what he's asking, it's after dinner, they're in the living room, they're playing with trains, and Grandpa says, tonight you wanna which who sleep. That's what he says. The phonology for him, the word WITH, with, he pronounces as which. Okay, so the sentence is, if we were to gloss it word for word into English, it would be, tonight you wanna with who sleep. Okay, if I were to further do a direct translation word for word into Mandarin, 今晚, I don't know if there are Mandarin speakers in the group here. 今晚你要跟谁睡? Tonight you want with who sleep. It means tonight, who do you want to sleep with? Okay, so this is how they were communicating with him at home. And by the way, they only speak English when they're speaking to him, to Oscar. So if you could imagine, right, at the dinner table, you turn to say something to Oscar and you speak using, what I think we would all, agree is English. They're using only English words, but with, right, the richness of all their other languages infused within it. And then they turn to each other and they speak, the languages that they're much more comfortable with. And so this just kept happening and happening and happening. If we had access to the screen share, I would share more videos with you. So yeah, that it really pushed me into, I started using more and more conversation analysis to look at these moments. And what a method like conversation analysis, which by the way, I wrote up recently with Laura Straponi, who is one of my colleagues at UC, I'm not at UC Berkeley, but one of my collaborators at UC Berkeley, about the potentials for conversation analysis to contribute to neurodiversity affirming and also, multilingual affirming therapy, because we were able to, without having to categorize what they're saying into particular languages, and also, the child, as they were in that video, if we could see it better, you'll see actually all of his turns are echoes of what Grandpa says. And so, all these moments of echolalia or of just vocalizations of, that were not being counted in language samples, because again, when you draw hard lines between what is worthy data and what isn't, all kinds of stuff gets tossed out. Now, switching to the methods that are more, that are not very familiar to most SLTs, but are much more familiar to folks in, say, communication studies or linguistic anthropology, like that, those whose work is more about description and about the study of things as they are without trying to change it. Conversation analysis cares about flow. Speech language therapy, the analysis and the tools we have care about utterances. It's like in isolation. Maybe we're looking at a couple of utterances. They said this and we said this back, okay? But a conversation analysis transcript, it requires me to look microsecond by microsecond, stacked one after another. It's a sequential analysis of what's happening. So in the sequence, you start seeing where timing matters, where children are, in Oscar's case, for example, the timing of him answering Grandpa is very much a faithful participation in turn taking, without indication that he is really understanding what Grandpa is asking him. So, you see this effort on part of the child to participate despite this linguistic difficulty. And of course, it also raises the question of, is the linguistic difficulty coming up because they're all speaking in a way that is, really kind of effortful for them, in this glossing into English, really what they could probably express more easily in Chinese. But regardless of that, and I also want to be very careful not to fall into the trap of saying, oh, they're speaking bad English, because they're not. They're speaking beautiful English. It's creative and it's lovely. And it is their English. This is another thing that I think is worth at least questioning, if not outright rejecting, that someone owns English, right? That there's a proper way of saying it and that other versions of it are bad. So, that's definitely not the message, is that, they're speaking bad English and that's causing problems. But there's definitely speaking in a way that moment by moment requires construction, and that they are not able to rely on the conventions that they all share, whether linguistically or culturally and all that. And so, right, that's sort of where I arrived, is really leaning on the tools that are not meant for a speech language therapist, but trying to do something with that. So, for example, instead of remediating, instead of saying, oh, I've analyzed your language sample, or like I've given this test and I have located these are the trouble spots, and we're gonna, teach your child such and such social skills or such and such linguistic skills. I've been more and more just sitting down with families and looking at these videos and just talking about what we see. And I also, because if you're moving away from prescriptivism and you're going towards descriptivism as a tool to facilitate your problem solving, then we sit together and we describe what we see, and we also talk about what is it that you hope from looking, from understanding these moments, and often what I'll ask is for families to record for me moments that they like to them feel really satisfying as moments of interaction. And moments to them that feel just frustrating in some way that they want to problem solve. And it's so instructive for them to define what those moments are, as opposed to for me to say, this is the problem spot. If they bring in their own data and they've defined for themselves, these are moments that for me, just something is not working. And we look at them together, and we can just describe, oh, this is where I see, right? It seems like they're the direction of the conversation is not aligning. For example, something we see very frequently is that the adults are on a teaching sequence. What does a dog say? What does a cat say? The known questions where you ask questions to which you already know the answer. And then the children are actually honestly trying to communicate and not answering the known questions. They're actually, trying to do something more conversational, and they're frustrating each other because they're on a different path. Their sequence is not flowing in the same way. So actually just talking that through is really interesting. And we've had families, for example, who have come, and when they come to our clinic, I supervise a university clinic. And so, the clients who come to the clinic are people in the community, and the clinic that I supervise, we focus on parent children, autistic children, and families who are multilingual. And so, I remember one family came, and they and the parents were very, very worried about the child only speaking in movie scripts. They said, we don't want him to speak like this anymore. We want him to have real conversation. Okay. And so we recorded it. I mean, I don't presume I know what's going on. We recorded it, we looked at it, and, they would have dinner, and the child might say something like, I'm Lord Shen, which is the evil peacock from Kung Fu Panda, and we could see when we analyze, he's so persistent in doing that we realize that's his conversation opener. He's not just echoing lines from a movie for no reason. So and as we looked at this together, the parents and us, and they said, he doesn't start conversations, and well, he does it in this way. Or, he doesn't say anything creative, but we saw actually, he said, I'm Lord Shen, and nobody paid attention to him. So he code switched into Mandarin, and then, gave up on his mom and said to his grandma, 婆婆,我是孔雀, which means I'm a peacock. So in that one turn, you see that he is using all his language resources to do something very creative, which is he keeps going after what he's going after. But he knows grandma doesn't know Lord Shen, so he genericized it to peacock. And he changed it into Mandarin because she also doesn't speak English. And so you see this, this is not just echoing, like you think of echolalia, and often people think that it's really mindless, just repeating for no, just repeating. But you see the agency and the creativity in these repetitions. And so they just became easier with the echolalia. And then we kept recording them. with subsequent interactions where they were coming in with more ease with these scripts. And so we see them, he would say, "I'm Totoro," which is also another movie. And they would embody Totoro with them. They started acting out the scenes together. And in defiance of what they were previously expecting, which is, I don't want to indulge this thing that I think is, keeping my child from having real conversations. So they would redirect him. They turn them into teaching sequences. Like when he starts scripting, they would spin it into something else. And they started leaning into those and actually joining him in pretend playing these scenarios from the movies. And you're probably not going to be surprised to hear that they got really creative conversations embedded in those scenarios that they've never heard before. They started telling them about their day, as they were acting out scenes from Totoro. And the echolalia and the scripting scaffolded the very kind of language and the very kind of interactions that they were craving and looking for. So again, I mean, there's not, I think the tricky thing about working like this is that you don't know where it's going to go. And it's a very unsafe feeling, I think, for clinicians, where we like to know what the goals are. And like, we're going to take 1, 2, and 3 steps to get there. We're going to do so many trials and take data. And it's very hard to do it in this way. Gosh, I see we're coming up on the hour here. And again, I meant for the more conversational, and I probably didn't give you enough space to jump in. So I'll just stop talking for a little bit. And
yeah, I mean, if anyone has any questions, I suppose, particularly speech and language therapists, if any of what you've heard kind of, resonates with your own practice, or you have any questions, do either put them in the chat or just come on camera and mic. Chloe. Hi, Chloe.
Hello, can you hear me okay?
We can, yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much, Betty. It's been great hearing you talk, honestly, it's amazing. I've got 2 questions. The first is kind of a more broad one, and the second is more clinically focused. But I just wondered what your thoughts are on why the profession, both SLT and SLP, is sometimes fearful of moving towards the approach you're talking about, and kind of what do we stand to gain by remaining in this prescriptivist kind of approach. I'm just wondering, what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I have been thinking about that quite a lot because, and you know what? I find the answer very quickly when I try to apply this in settings that have very particular constraints. So, for example, in the university clinic, I think we have more freedom to play because our services are free, and so we don't have funders who we need to answer to. And also, I don't have any kind of legal constraints on what kind of services I need to provide. And when we go into a school-based service setting, a few things come up. One is, the kind of therapy, the kind of approach that I was describing, often what is remediated is actually not the child at all. So, for example, in the scenario that I just gave, the parents and the adults really did most of the adaptations. They changed up what they did, and it had a very direct effect on what the child did. But we didn't have any goals for the child as a result of that. And again, I don't know how it is in the UK and other places where you're working, but that doesn't really translate at all into an education plan where you're supposed to write goals for the child, right? So a medical approach to therapy, the person who's supposed to change is always the person who has been identified as having a disorder. Right? Then you can create a therapy or education plan with their name on it. But as soon as you open up to this more kind of sociocultural approach, then often you find, oh, you know what? The participation's to barrier is people's attitudes. That could change. It's that this environment is, overwhelming the child in terms of its sensory input, so we changed that. But I can't, I mean, who am I writing goals for? Where is the education plan? And, who is the responsible party? Usually the party who's responsible for change is designated as the person with the disorder. And it just flips everything. It becomes hard to characterize what our job is.
Which is so ironic, really. We're writing goals for these children or adults, and then in doing so, we're in some ways removing them from the situation and not meeting their needs, despite writing goals for them. It's really ironic.
That's right.
Yeah, and you kind of answered my second question, because I've recently qualified and I'm working in the NHS, so in the National Health Service, and I'm already kind of grappling with how I start to apply a lot of the things I'm learning and have learned within an NHS context because of those barriers and because of those restrictions. You've kind of addressed that already, but I wondered if you had any kind of advice on how to do that.
What I've gotten good at, because I also, live in the world and we have to problem solve these things. So what I've gotten good at is writing very kind of long goals that sound like it's about the child, but actually if you read carefully, all of the things that you're trying to change are external to them. So maybe Johnny will Johnny will achieve, longer conversational sequences with the support of conversational partners who do this and that and the other. So it's right. The side of the equation I actually really care about is all in the prepositions. So I sneak it into the prepositions, but the main sentence sounds like it's about the child, that I can try and anticipate, one likely effect of us just turning down the fluorescent lights, so that it's not flickering and driving them, just giving them a migraine, is that they might participate more. So, maybe it looks like I'm writing a participation goal, but really it's the goal about creating a more comfortable sensory environment with a good faith, prediction that it would increase their participation. But usually we go straight for the increasing participation, and then we start cueing the child, speak more, take your turn, raise your hand, and that's not really where the issue is. We could really back off from the, leave them alone. we can make other adjustments where that just comes about naturally. But yeah, I did a lot of workarounds. That's what I've.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks so much.
I'm aware that we have 2 minutes over, so I think we better wrap up. I'm sure Betty would be happy to hear from people who have other questions, or you can put them in the chat and we can sort of pass them on to Betty. Because I know lots of you are speech and language therapists, so it would be, it's hopefully a really good opportunity for you to talk about practice and have sort of professional conversations. There's lots of nice comments in the chat, Betty, if you haven't already seen them.
Yeah, I'm looking at them, and let me put my email address in the chat, and you're welcome to email me. And a lot of the things I'm talking about, I'm trying to write and get them out so that they can be shared through another venue. So I have some articles I can share, and I have other things that I can send to you if you email me.
That would be great. Yeah, thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. So thank you so much, Betty, and thank you everyone for coming. And I can see that everybody found it really helpful and insightful. So thank you. And that's the last of our CeLM seminars. Oh, Sarah had a question, but I mean, feel free to leave, everybody. Are you sure? Oh, was it by mistake?
No, sorry, my mistake. I was actually trying to do a thank you. Thank you, Betty.
So I will stop recording, and